The most terrifying moment in any relationship isn't the explosive argument, the shattered plates, or the venomous accusations. Those things actually show that someone still cares enough to fight. The real horror begins with a quiet, hollow click, the sound of an empath finally switching off. It's the silence that follows when a person who once felt everything for you suddenly feels absolutely nothing. Stay with me, because what happens in this shift rewrites every rule of emotional power you've ever known. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in psychology, discovered that the human psyche doesn't just break under pressure, it transforms. When an empath reaches their absolute threshold, they don't just crack or have a meltdown. They undergo a fundamental evolution, turning into something cold, precise, and completely unreachable to those who spent years taking them for granted. We live in a world that mistakes an empath's kindness for a bottomless well. People see their patience, their constant forgiveness, and their willingness to absorb pain as an infinite resource they can tap into whenever they want. But they couldn't be more wrong. Jung's research into psychological compensation proves that the mind demands balance. If you force an empath to suppress their own needs, their boundaries, and their anger for too long, those feelings don't just evaporate into thin air. Instead, they ferment beneath the surface until they hit a critical mass. This is where the danger lies. When that pressure becomes too much, the psyche protects itself by flipping entirely. Jung called this phenomenon enantiodromia, the point where a force becomes its own opposite. Think of it like a rubber band that has been stretched to its absolute limit. It doesn't just stay stretched, it snaps back with a force that is equal to all the tension it held. For the empath, this means the person who once loved too deeply, gave too freely, and stayed too long suddenly hits a psychological wall. In that moment, the caring doesn't just fade, it disappears. This shift isn't a slow, gradual decline where you can negotiate or apologize your way back into their heart. It is a total, instantaneous, and absolute shutdown of the emotional connection. This is the silent shift that catches people off guard. One minute, the empath is your biggest supporter, the person who validates your feelings and carries your burdens as if they were their own. You've grown used to them being the safe harbor you can always return to after you've mistreated them. But the next minute, you are a ghost to them. You can cry, you can plead, and you can promise to change, but the, quote, receiver in them has been dismantled. Because they spent so much energy being, quote, all in, when they decide to be, quote, all out, there is no middle ground left. They aren't acting out of spite or trying to hurt you. They have simply moved into a state of psychological survival where you no longer exist as a priority. You haven't just lost their love, you've lost their recognition of you as a person they need to care for. And that is a void you can never fill again. The breakthrough of the shadow is the moment the internal architect of the empath finally decides to stop building bridges for people who only want to burn them. For years, empaths exist in a state of grueling, unpaid emotional labor. They don't just walk into a room, they absorb it. They pick up on the hidden tension, the unspoken sadness, and the simmering anger of everyone around them like a high-powered emotional sponge. This isn't just a personality trait, it's a full-time job that drains their battery to zero every single day. They operate under the beautiful yet dangerous delusion that if they just care enough, listen long enough, or absorb enough pain, they can heal the broken people in their lives. But this path doesn't lead to a miracle. It leads straight to self-destruction. When the empath finally hits that wall, the world expects a breakdown. People expect them to cry, to collapse, or to beg for help. But what actually happens is far more powerful. It's a breakthrough. Carl Jung realized that when an empath finally stops caring in the traditional sense, they aren't actually becoming cold or heartless. They are finally becoming whole. Up until this point, the empath has lived a fragmented life, pushing away any part of themselves that felt mean, selfish, or guarded. They spent their entire existence repressing their shadow, that darker, protective side of the psyche that every human needs to survive. The breakthrough happens when the empath stops running from their shadow and finally shakes its hand. Integrating the shadow is like finally installing a high-tech security system in a house that's been left wide open for years. This is the part of the soul that instinctively knows how to say a firm, unapologetic no. It is the part that can spot an emotional vampire, those people who feed on your light without ever giving back, from a mile away. The shadow understands a hard truth that the polite empath was too afraid to face. Not everyone deserves a seat at your table, and not everyone is entitled to the gold inside your heart. By embracing this darker side, the empath isn't turning into a villain. They are simply becoming a person with a spine. They are learning that being good does not mean being a doormat. This transition is the core of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you are actually meant to be. In this stage, there comes a fork in the road where you must make a radical choice. You either choose the world or you choose yourself. For the empath, this choice feels like the ultimate betrayal. They have been conditioned by society, family, and toxic partners to believe that putting their own needs first is the definition of selfish. They've been taught that their only value lies in how much they can endure for others. But Jung exposed the lie in this logic. He argued that self-abandonment, denying your own needs to keep others happy, is actually the greatest act of violence you can commit against your own psyche. It is a slow-motion suicide of the soul. When an empath finally stops this cycle of internal violence, a miraculous shift occurs. They don't lose their ability to feel deeply, and they don't lose their compassion. Instead, they gain something they've never had before: ironclad boundaries. They stop being a sponge and start being a filter. They trade that infinite patience, which was really just a lack of self-respect, for what Jung termed psychological sovereignty. This means they are finally the rulers of their own internal kingdom. They no longer ask for permission to protect their peace. They don't negotiate with people who drain them. They have finally realized that their energy is a currency, and they are no longer handing it out for free to people who don't know its value. The shift into psychological immunity is the moment the fog finally clears, and it happens with the quiet precision of a key turning in a lock. For years, the empath has been pouring their life force, their time, and their sanity into a bottomless well, hoping that one day the water would finally rise. They've been exhausted, drained, and desperate. But then, in a single, unceremonious instant of clarity, they just stop. There is no grand explosion, no screaming match, and no dramatic exit. It is a silent internal no that changes the molecular structure of the relationship. They simply refuse to participate in their own diminishment any longer. They realize that the well isn't just empty, it's broken, and no amount of pouring will ever fix it. This is exactly where the situation becomes chilling for the manipulator. You see, a manipulator's entire playbook relies on two specific hooks: guilt and hope. They keep the empath tethered by making them feel responsible for the manipulator's happiness, or by feeding them just enough hope that things will get better if only the empath tries harder. It's a psychological leash that is held firm for years. But the moment the empath reaches true emotional detachment, they develop what can only be described as psychological immunity. It's as if they've been vaccinated against the very tactics that used to destroy them. Suddenly, The guilt trips that used to cause sleepless nights don't even register. The accusations of being selfish or cold no longer sting. They just sound like background noise. When this immunity sets in, the manipulator's most powerful weapons become completely useless. The love bombing, those grand fake gestures of affection meant to suck the empath back in, suddenly looks transparent and desperate. The empath sees the strings behind the puppet show. They aren't looking through the eyes of a victim anymore. They are looking through the eyes of a witness. The leash hasn't just been loosened, it has been cut at the base. The manipulator will often try to pull harder, using every trick in the book to spark a reaction, but they find themselves pulling on thin air. The emotional hook that used to live inside the empath's chest has been removed, leaving nowhere for the manipulator to latch onto. What makes an awakened empath truly untouchable is that they are no longer operating from a place of bitterness or revenge. Bitterness is still a form of connection. It's a hot emotion that keeps you tied to the person you hate. But the awakened empath has moved past that into radical acceptance. They don't hate you. Hating you would take too much energy. Instead, they simply see you accurately for the first time in the history of the relationship. The distortion of hope has vanished. For years, they didn't see who you actually were. They saw your potential or the person they hoped you would become. Now, that filter is gone. They see the patterns, the lies, and the lack of empathy with clinical, haunting clarity. In this state of radical acceptance, the empath finally drops the heavy burden of trying to fix or save you. They have removed the filter of compassion that used to excuse your worst behaviors. They no longer believe the lie that their love is a magic wand that can heal someone who refuses to do the work themselves. They see the relationship without the rose-tinted delusion, and they realize that there is nothing left to fight for because there was never a real partnership to begin with. In that moment of absolute clarity, the manipulator loses every single ounce of leverage they ever possessed. You cannot control someone who no longer needs your validation, no longer fears your anger, and no longer believes your lies. The game is over because the empath has finally realized they were the only ones playing for keeps. The power of indifference is the final stage of an empath's evolution, and it is the most formidable position a human being can occupy in any relationship. This isn't the cold, calculated indifference of a person trying to play hard to get or win a power struggle. This is an indifference born from deep, hard-earned wisdom. When an empath finally stops caring, they don't transform into a villain or become cruel. They don't have the energy for malice, and frankly, they don't think you're worth the effort of a grudge. Instead, they simply become unavailable, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. They don't seek revenge because they've realized that the best payback isn't hurting you, it's making you irrelevant. They simply disappear from the equation of your life, leaving a void that no amount of noise can fill. In this state, the empath undergoes a massive behavioral shift that leaves the other person spinning. They stop explaining themselves. They stop defending their reality. Most importantly, they stop trying to make you understand their point of view. For years, they may have begged for your empathy, crafted long messages to explain their hurt, or stayed up until 3 a.m. trying to fix a misunderstanding. But now, silence. They have reached what Jung called psychological completion. This is the point where their internal world has become so solid and so self-contained that their sense of worth no longer requires even a single shred of your validation. They don't need you to agree with them. They don't need you to see their side. And they certainly don't need your permission to be done. This is the exact moment an empath becomes truly dangerous. People often think dangerous means someone who will lash out or cause a scene. But the most dangerous person is the one who has absolutely nothing left to lose to you. They are dangerous because they are finally capable of walking away and never looking back. There is no apology grand enough to reach them anymore, because they no longer value the words coming out of your mouth. There is no promise of things will be different this time that can pull them back into the cycle, because they've finally seen the blueprint of the trap. You can't manipulate someone who has disconnected their heart from the outcome of the relationship. The true beauty of this transition is that the empath has found something infinitely more valuable than a toxic connection. They have found their way back to themselves. They have realized that their ability to care, to feel, and to nurture was never a weakness. It was a high-value gift they were giving away to someone who didn't know how to handle it. By reclaiming that gift, they are finally whole again. Once that gift is withdrawn, the power dynamic shifts permanently. You are no longer dealing with a sponge who will absorb your toxicity. You are dealing with a sovereign force that you can no longer influence, move, or control. They have returned home to who they always were before the world convinced them that suffering was the price of love. When an empath is done, they aren't just leaving you, they are arriving at their own doorstep, and they are locking the door behind them. Ultimately, the withdrawal of an empath's care is the loudest silence you will ever hear. It marks the moment they realize that their light is too bright to be wasted on someone who only wants to dim it. They have traded the exhausting cycle of saving others for the liberating truth of saving themselves. Their departure isn't an act of war, it is an act of self-preservation. They aren't walking away to hurt you, they are walking away because you no longer have the power to hurt them. This is the ultimate transformation, the day the emotional sponge becomes an unbreakable wall.